Well, welcome to this event on Ukrainian literature. I'm Peter Wolberg, professor here at GW, and with me is Katerina Kazimirova, the editor, co-editor of the volume Voices of Freedom that we are going to talk about today, and also Catherine Donovan, who organized this event gratefully. And as people are coming in, I will talk a little bit about what this book has actually done and the achievement of this book, on which I really can only congratulate the editors and the publishers, because it actually is the result of enormous amount of work. And I will say, not just because it's logistically quite an achievement, but also intellectually. And so here's what I want to emphasize. Ukrainian literature has become a focus of the literary world, so to speak, in the last couple of years, mostly because of the events in Ukraine. Unfortunately, also because of the war. These are the paradoxical effects of wars, that they suddenly increase our cultural interest in the countries that are victimized here, that are attacked. And so I wish we would have better reasons for interest in Ukrainian literature. But as it is, this is also very important. And I will say also something about the war as a factor in this book. Who knew a lot about Ukrainian literature before the events in Ukraine in the last couple of decades? I would dare to say very few people actually did, outside of Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora. The Ukrainian diaspora is culturally very active. We have, of course, a huge diaspora in Canada. We have intellectual centers, apart from Canadian University, also at Harvard and some other places. But otherwise, I would say that Ukrainian literature played a relatively marginal role in the Western cultural consciousness. And there are reasons for that that have to do with the dominance of Russian culture and literature in the field. This is just objectively a fact. I'm neither denouncing it nor welcoming it. That's just the fact. But Ukrainian literature, even in its highest achievements, was not noticed very much. And so people who study Ukrainian literature will, of course, know about Taras Shevchenko, which is the name, and we even have a Shevchenko monument here in Washington. And every year or so, Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians, or people who love Ukraine gather there at this monument and celebrate the legacy of Shevchenko and Ukraine in general. We have authors such as Lesya Ukrainka, who is a 19th, early 20th century author. We have the great novelist, unfortunately not enough known, Mikhailo Kotsubinsky, but those of you who are interested in cinema probably know the film Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, which is based on a Kotsubinsky novel about the Hutsuls, an ethnic minority in Ukraine. And so these are all some sporadic facts of Ukrainian literature, but overall, the development of Ukrainian literature before the Soviet period was little known. Then we have the Soviet period, and it started with a bloodbath because several members of the Ukrainian avant-garde, which was located in Kharkiv and in Kiev, were slaughtered, we have to say, by the Soviet Secret Service. I'm not saying the Russian here because it was really communist. It was internationalist, communist. There were Ukrainians, Russians, Georgians, all kinds of people were involved. They all shared a communist worldview. That's really important to remember. And the victims were avant-garde poets, mostly poets of the Ukrainian cultural community. By the end of the 1930s, their numbers were decimated. And what was left were basically writers who had politically adjusted. There were names such as Kornichuk and Alexandr Shar, who are now forgotten more or less, but who were very, very pro-communist, very anti-nationalist. So for them, Ukrainian patriotism was a no-no, was not tolerated. And this legacy has also basically been discarded after the end of the Soviet system, of the communist system. There is no longer much interest in the writings of these authors. Although I have to say, for example, I reviewed a couple of von Schaar works some decades ago, and actually some of it is not all that bad, but it is really tainted by this communist legacy, by this communist worldview, and therefore it is part of its time. What Katerina Kazimirova and her co-editor have done, they have actually captured a phenomenon that has little to do with the pre-1917, pre-October Revolution legacy of Ukrainian literature, and virtually nothing with the Soviet legacy of Ukrainian literature, and is a phenomenon all of its own. That's why I think the title Voices of Freedom is quite justified. It is really a phenomenon of the last 30 years. It is a free culture, it's a free literature that's unprecedented. It's not related to Russian literature, neither in a good nor in a bad sense. It really is very much part of its own cultural influences and so on. And there's a whole variety of styles. We have modernists, we have postmodernists, we have realistic fiction, we have unrealistic fiction, a lot of poetry, by the way. When you are a full-time poet, that means you have a hard time making a living. And so you need to be an enthusiast. You really need to dedicate yourself completely to this art, to writing poetry, publishing poetry, basically free of charge. So we have a lot of poets in this volume, which is one of its main quality. It starts out with poems. Even famous authors of novels, such as Serhiy Zhadan, is represented with poems, which really I found interesting. I have explored Ukrainian literature a little bit in the past few years, and I was surprised by the high quality of the poetry that is represented in this volume. So what I want to congratulate the editors on is, first of all, that Katerina and also the publishers and the authors and translators, they have captured a phenomenon that is a phenomenon of our time, and they have given it a systematic form. So basically, anybody who wants to know about Ukrainian literature in our time can take this volume as a guide. You know, we have 27 authors there, both with short stories and poetry. And I would recommend, if you like any of those authors, also we see some of them in the film right in a moment, keep looking for their books. Many of them are now represented in translation. But the problem is, I have to say, and we just talked about this before the event started, the publishers are very small. They are really small publishers here in the United States and in Great Britain. And so names such as Lost Horse Press, Astra House, Old Line Publishing, and so on, they indicate that these are small presses that don't make much of a profit on these books. They are based on the work of enthusiasts. And so I would say the dominating spirit of this volume is enthusiasm. What all these authors share, whether they're politically engaged, more or less, some are not, others are very strongly engaged politically, they share a love for Ukraine. It's a very strong love. It's not in any way politically motivated, as far as I can see. It has political consequences, but originally what it is, it's a genuine love for their country, for the language of Ukrainian, which is not just a dialect, which is not just, a derivation but it's a full-blown language with its own melodiousness, with its own music. And so the authors really show their love. And I would say, so do the translators. And the translators, I just want to give you one example because I was surprised by that. There's one of the translators, his name is Charles Bonds, and he translated poems here actually by Pavlo Karapchuk. And right, several works. And so here's this gentleman, Charles Bonds. He holds a doctorate in history from Indiana University. He's the vice president of Art and Soul of Ukraine, an organization that supports artists, art therapy, and beautification projects in Ukraine. He teaches English in Lviv, writes poetry and prose, volunteers, and paints digitally and on canvas. I mean, such an interesting personality, and I would say he's one of several who have actually contributed to this volume. So it's enthusiasm on the part of the editors, of the publishers, of course, of the authors, and of the translators. One other phenomenon I want to emphasize here, which I find quite interesting, Ukrainian literature is not Kiev-centric. It is actually spread all over Ukraine, and several of the authors live, in Lviv, in Ivano-Frankivsk, and so on, in several other places, and stay there and have lived there for all their lives. And so that also emphasizes the regional bonds, the regional roots of these authors in Ukraine today. And I find that quite fascinating. So I also want to say that the one problem that I see really is the trend toward decommunization. I think if you look at one of the most famous Ukrainian artists, the film director and writer Alexander Dovzhenko, who was both a Ukrainian patriot and a communist, a real arch communist, then I don't think that it's really possible to completely throw out the legacy of communism in Ukrainian culture. But that's something for the future that needs to be done, addressed, and so on, by scholars and enthusiasts and so on, to find the algorithm to actually include the legacies, both pre-1917, post-1917, and of course, post-1991 in today's cultural processes. So thank you again for your terrific work on this. And should we let Katerina say a few words maybe first, and then we watch the film. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Peter. So such a great introduction. I have no words after that to add. So as we said, this is a book of poetry, short stories, and essays, all explaining Ukraine in different mosaic perspectives. And this is a great introduction for all who wants to know more about Ukrainian literature or just start this journey with Ukrainian literature. We had the goal to open Ukrainian literature starting from 60s, and this volume opens a poem of Ihar Kalinets, representative of generation of 60s. They also fight for our freedom. And also the goal shows this personality, not just the works, but there's people behind the news now and behind this fiction and this literature, who developing this topic of fighting for freedom in their art, in their creativity, all their lives. And it's not just war literature, it's not just war stories and poems. Of course, they are after February 2024, but also after 2014, when it's actually war started. This modern war started, but you can find here different topics: love, friendship, significance of home, challenges, and what we're losing, and how we again discovering themselves, memory of generation, connections of this generation. And of course, we wanted to introduce to our readers our writers themselves. That's why we recorded this short movie in Kyiv this year. It's early January, when we had in all Ukraine this total blackout, when people didn't have any electricity, heating, and only a car traffic light was only one light available. So opening poem by Ivan Androsyak, one of the most significant Ukrainian poets from the 90s generation. And he created different styles, which is still developing, which is still other younger generation of poets working in the style. And he also author of enormous children books, and editor of Publishing House for Children. But in 2021, he back to poetry, and he started writing this big poem which called "The Soul to Love Silence." And fragment of this poem will start in English this movie, and then you will see three poets reading both in Ukrainian and in English translation in voiceover. And first of them is Svetlana Povalyeva. She's also a prominent Ukrainian poet and writer, prose writer. She actually started as a prose writer in 90s, novels, urban style language novels. And after Crimean annexation, she found it impossible anymore write full length works and switched to poetry. And recently she published her second collection of poems, but in English translation. It's her first translations ever in this book. And also she prominent activist, and maybe lots of heard about the name of her son, Roman Ratushny. She lost her son this last year during the fighting for Kharkiv region, and her son died at the age of 25, just defending our country. After you will see and hear Ivan Malkovich. He is a prominent figure, also poet and publisher, and he created one of the most successful brand publishing house, Avabalamaha, and it still operates even during these circumstances in Ukraine. He published new books, and this is really impressive, almost magical. And then finishes all this movie, younger generation, representative of younger generation poetic, Luba Yakimchuk. She's an award-winning Ukrainian poet and screenwriter. And also she's from the east of Ukraine, from Luhansk, and she lost her hometown, her home 9 years ago, and she developed this team of women losing her hometown and trying to restore life for her and her family and people around her again. So no longer talking, and what I'll just ask you, just pay attention to dates these poems were written, and also today is a poetry day, so I think it's a really good chance and celebrate poetry in that way.
Okay? No, that's fine. I'll turn off the mic.
Henceforth, snow will no longer be white. Henceforth, it won't even be snow. Only a dream in which quivering silence stays afloat on the water. Henceforth, water will no longer flow, but will simply flee from wasteland to wasteland. And no one knows whom to flee. Perhaps from water. The terrain is awash in a silence, thick to the eye, bitter to fingers, cold in the veins. It seeps into pores, forces cracks open, bites into shores. Given the slightest of chances, it's already inside you. Oh, how resounding this silence. It was the first world silence, so oppressive that in the end God couldn't stand it. He added clay and kneaded the earth. But silence struggled through the earth, grew stronger, bubbled up, and burst. Thus, sound was born. And from that sound came beasts and birds and beasts and more beasts and people. And they were happy with the silence, cavorted, clapped their hands, shouting so loudly that the earth winced. And God listened to them, listened and couldn't get enough. When the doves flew south, a wall of white sun rose across the sky and wouldn't let them through. And the doves were at a loss, and went soft, and knew not where to fly, into the night or from it. And they folded their wings and plummeted into the naked sky. And stone and amen were there, and amen smote with stone.
5 ранку. Це в Києві той зачарований час, коли час сміттєвозів, час справжніх міських фріків, час духів, привидів і боронителів цієї землі. Стою на балконі, як на палубі, туман яром, божковим яром, тиша. І тут, у цьому тумані, слава Україні! І глухо у відповідь: героям слава! Ну, наче доброго ранку в селі між сусідами. Змішую собі туман з димом, дим із туманом. Ось вони. Ми їх зазвичай не бачимо, а вони тут навіть не сплять, захисники. Для містян привиди, а деякі дійсно привиди, вже кілька століть привиди. Бо як же підеш? Землю ж свою, як ти кинеш, коли о 4-5 ранку зазвичай починається штурм.
5 o'clock in the morning in Kyiv. It's a kind of enchanted time. The time of garbage trucks, the time of hardcore urban freaks, the time of spirits, ghosts, and protectors of this land. I stand on my balcony as on the bow of a ship and say to the fog, "Glory to Ukraine." A deaf response, "Glory to the heroes." So goes the good morning of village neighbors. I twirl my cigarette. The smoke swirls with the fog. Ah, it's them. We usually don't see them, but here they are, even without sleep, our defenders. For the city dwellers, they are ghosts. Some of them actually are ghosts from across the centuries. Because how can you leave? How can you quit your land when between 4 and 5 in the morning, the missile strikes usually begin?
Люблю тебе впізнавати на всіх картах світу. Ловлю твій лет на глобусах пруткообертальних. Мила моя вітчизно, кумедії моя зворушлива. Ні пташка, ні звірятко, ні ведмедик, ні качечка, ані гусеня, ведме гуся. Оце ж тобі небесний Гансе християни, ще одне бридке качатко. Головою в Європі, хвостом до матрьошки, з Вороніщиною й Кубанщиною була б ти пишногузніша. Утікаєш, небо, від тої всепоглинаючої матрьошки, що всіх своїм Кремлем накриває, утікаєш, ніяк не втечеш. Орди матрьощенків на чужих батарейках зачаїлися в тобі. Обліпили тебе й рідні псевдотелесики, що чубляться, ниють і лукаво обіцяють пшонця під крильця і обскубують. Але ось я примружуюсь і ясно бачу, як ти розбігаєшся по воді, набираєш ротом повітря, твоє відстовбурчене крильце готове до польоту. Розбігаєшся, летиш, співаєш, клекочеш. Надихаєш і будеш нас серцем, і любиш нас крильцем. Боюсь за твою ліву лапку.
I love recognizing you on maps the world over, following your flight on swiftly spinning globes. My dear homeland, my touching comedy. You are not a bird, or a little animal, or a cub, or a duckling, or a goose. You're a bear goose. Here's another ugly little duckling for you up there in the sky, Hans Christian. with your head in Europe and your tail facing a nesting doll. And your rear would be much plumper with Voronezh and Kuban. You run away from that all-consuming nesting doll that smothers everyone with its Kremlin. You run, but can't quite get away. Hordes of nesting doll backers running on foreign batteries are lurking inside you. But here I am, squinting and clearly seeing you racing across the water, inhaling air, your protruding wing ready to take flight. You pick up speed, fly, sing, croak, and inspire us, and awaken us with your heart. You love us with your wing, but I'm worried about your left paw.
Кажуть, повітря було густе, хоч ріж. Вони не різали, а прострілювали в ньому діри, а потім розріджували градами і смерчами, щоб можна було дістатись до Києва. Птахи, що літали у небі, випорожнювались бомбами впереміжку з людьми. Це все летіло на голови прямими чи змінними траєкторіями. Діяла лише одна заповідь – врятуй ближнього свого, знищ окупанта свого. Лише одна заповідь діяла. Дід спочатку блював, а потім угнав танк із поля бою. Кнопка маса, перша, друга передача, усе дуже просто, поїхали. Жінки, гнучкі та округлі, пакували в валізи аптечки і паспорти, турнікети й бинти пакували, пакували дітей і котів, пакували життя, скручуючи в джгутики, щоб більше влізло. Бабуся зустрічала окупантів з насінням. Беріть, хлопчики, покладіть до кишень. Як загинете, проростуть у тілах соняхи. Буде красиво. Поїзди блискучі, як змії, іскрились степами. Півкраїни стали біженцями. Півкраїни їх приймали. Півкраїни їх захищали. Півкраїни допомогу підвозили. Звідки взялись ці 200% людей від загальної кількості мешканців? Оборона була тактична, а от зміни були тектонічні. Крим відколовся на перешийку, струсивши із себе загарбників, дрейфував та пристав до Одеси та обріз підборіддям нових берегів. А на сході України, а на півночі України протекло ціле море крові, Чорне море крові, вздовж нових берегів. Але першої домедичної допомоги окупантам ніхто не надав.
The air, they said, so thick you could slice it. They didn't cut it, they riddled it with holes, thinned it out with missile launchers, hail, and rocket systems, tornado, trying to reach all the way to Kyiv. Birds that flew in the sky shot bombs, intermingled with people down on our heads, following trajectories, now straight, now variable. Only one commandment still stood: save your neighbor, destroy your occupier. Only one commandment was actionable. An old man who couldn't stop vomiting finally stole a tank from the battlefield, found the ignition button marked mass, shifted gears, simple as that. Let's go. Women, lithe and well-rounded, packed their suitcases with emergency kits and passports, tourniquets and bandages, packed their children and cats, packed up their lives, rolling them so that more would fit in. A granny greeted the occupiers with seeds. Take it, boys. Let me fill your pockets. When you perish, sunflowers will sprout from within your flesh. There will be beauty. Trains, glossy as serpents, sparkled along the steppe. Half the country turned into refugees. Half the country took them in. Half the country stood up for them. Half the country drove in aid and supplies. Where did they come from? Those 200% of the general population? The defense was still tactical, but the changes were tectonic. The Crimea broke off at the isthmus, shaking off the invaders, drifted and moored at Odessa, grew a triple chin of new shores. In the east of Ukraine and the north of Ukraine flowed a sea of blood, a black sea of blood along the new coastline. And first medical aid never came to the rescue.
Yeah, I just want to add something to my words in the introduction. I always looked at the computer because the camera is there. That's why I apologize for that. But what impressed me at first reading, first of all, the courage to give poetry such a prominent position in this book, right? Because one would imagine that a more explicitly political message, polemics, and so on would be expected, and the opposite is true, right? And Andrusiak's poetry is so universal, it's so philosophical. It's really, there's nothing propagandistic in it, and so on. So the same I found in authors such as Oksana Zabushko, for example. Oksana Zabushko has several novels to her credit, and also a collection of short stories called Your Ad Might Go Here.
Could go here.
Could go here. There is, first of all, it's high quality prose. It's very witty. It's very Western. It's really more about I would say, Ukrainian consciousness engaging with Western European lifestyle, with American lifestyle, and so on. And so it speaks to us not so much as as messages coming from Ukraine about the state of affairs and so on, but more about our modern consciousness. And in this regard, this is high quality modern literature. And so Zabushko, I think she really deserves, she's one of the most decorated Ukrainian writers. She was not in the film, only mentioned once with her picture, but her novels have been translated into English, into many European languages. and so on. These are writers that are worthy of reading and engaging with personally, regardless of the fact where they're from. There are great authors just by themselves, and they write about all of our existential problems in this time, in the late 20th, early 21st century, and so on. And in the poetry, some lines simply spoke to me. So one was, I think, here in Kalinets, it was the steps of the soul. So the step, the landscape of the soul. I found this such a wonderful metaphor. Or Malkovich, Ivan Malkovich, who was featured here, he says in one poem, "I have too little hate. Even my explosive, enraged hammer has rusted. I make do with mere disdain." And so there is this really, I would say, a personal vulnerability here. It's and I would say the poetry actually proves that there is a cultural identity that has its roots in Ukraine. It's original. It is not secondary. It's not imitative. It is very, very self-sustaining, and it's interesting as such. That's why I said I think this literature deserves to be represented in the West, regardless of financial consideration that we talked about here, and that that's difficult to sell and so on and so on. Who knows? Maybe at some point it will be easier to sell. But I would say, as a phenomenon that indicates cultural identity, a strong cultural identity, with these 27 authors, that's really nothing to neglect. That is something that probably, I would say, the occupiers did not expect. I don't think they expected this kind of strong cultural identity that is really, I can say this as a specialist on Russian culture and Russian literature, that is unlike anything that has been produced in Russia in the last couple of decades, that is profoundly original Ukrainian. And I would say, and I hope I'm not going too far here, formulating that the battle for Ukraine is decided probably not in the last by a cultural aspects. I think that the field of culture is usually ignored by politicians, or they usually are not very knowledgeable in this, but actually for the sustainability, for the depth of this clash, I think culture and literature play a decisive role. So much for that. I just want to say it as a reaction to the film and to this excellent book.
Absolutely. And this is war, what is going on. It's also war for identity.
Yes.
And that's why it's so culture now and literature is so important.
Yeah.
And poetry, primary in Ukraine, always been, and now also it is.
Yeah.
Poetry is something that preserved our identity, our cultural code. And during discussion, we kind of came to the conclusion that poetry in Ukraine, it's kind of capsule of time. And now we recently seen this Kherson liberation, when our Ukrainian soldiers removed this Russian propagandic big billboards with Russia is here forever. And after that was Taras Shevchenko lines. And recently we celebrated his birthday, and it was such a uniting experience for everyone. Everyone posted lines from his poetry. He is no longer just poet, our school program poet. Everyone synchronized with this. Everyone read post this lines, different poetry, and that's why, poetry is something which unites our nation in time of changes, in time of challenges, and always.
Yeah. Another name that should be mentioned that I didn't talk about in my introduction is Hrigori Skovoroda, who was an 18th century philosopher, and who wrote in Ukrainian, in Russian, in Latin, in Greek, and he's really one of the greatest philosophers of the 18th century, not sufficiently known in the West, but what's new about that? And so he was also a poet. He also wrote poetry, and his 300th anniversary was celebrated last year in Ukraine. So Skovoroda, about whom there is Western literature, actually. There is scholarship in the West that can be read and studied. But basically, he's out of the current, as far as I can tell, philosophical discourses. But again, somebody who deserves to be rediscovered and included, including as a poet, right? So,
Absolutely, yeah. They're from Kharkiv region,
there you
a
go.
museum of Grigori Skovoroda, which
Yeah.
was destroyed
Yeah.
by missile attacks, and yeah, what we experienced every day with our cultural heritage.
Okay, maybe we should open the floor for questions. Please go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'd be happy to start. So you've spoken about the.
Introduce yourself.
My name is Gregory Pfeiffer. I'm a journalist. Spent many years in Moscow. I currently run the Institute of Current World Affairs fellowship program here in Washington, but also hoping to launch a project for a cultural literary magazine for contributors from the former Soviet Union, including Russians and Belarusians and Ukrainians and others. So my question is, could you speak a little bit more about your sort of selection criteria, or what you were thinking when you began the project, and if anything changed while you were commissioning and editing, and exactly what your priorities were? It seems a sort of a survey, an introduction, but exactly what considerations went into it as you were working?
Thank you for your question. Just war started. I was here in DC, and my vacation turned out to be a little bit longer than I expected, and didn't know what to do. But at the same time, we had this window of opportunity to talk about themselves again. We had this opportunity before several times during the revolutions and when war in Donbass started, but it's quickly everyone forget about this, and we didn't have such a support like now. Now it's absolutely phenomenal. We have support now. And of course, having this experience of not being heard and not in world attention, we decided to absolutely quickly got in this window of informational, in this media coverage, use this opportunity and publish book with pieces of literature. It's important for me, for all our translators who've been working on Ukrainian literature way before it's got more like in trend, more popular, and explain American audience, English-speaking audience, that there is Ukrainian rich, distinct culture, tradition, and you need to start also decolonize yourself, not just think about Russian literature as a great literature, and finally need to know Ukrainian, and it's a good start. And that's why we worked so quickly. We already put in publishing process by summer, so all the translation was during the last spring. It's all new translation. It's original in Ukrainian, and it's new translation just published last year. Work I personally love. It's one of my favorite works in Ukrainian literature. Also short form, just to quickly introduce to Ukrainian literature and to different themes, different topics, not just trying to balance between different forms, poetic, prose forms, also different topics, and not super overwhelmed with tragedy and overcoming this traumatic experience, but our humor, our humanity, which is also, you can read in almost every work, you can find something absolutely kind and light, if I can say that. So yeah, the main goal was use this opportunity talk about ourselves again, and in a poetic and fictional way. And also remember, also tell our writers who decide to stay in Ukraine. They almost, everyone who was in Ukraine, they stayed in Ukraine. We have several names who live in US for last 10, 20 years. It's a different story. But those who stay in Ukraine, they're still there, and support them. And by this book project, tell them that yes, you can be interested, and foreign audience and readership will read you, will publish you, will translate you. You're important. And even Scott Melnichuk, in his statement for this book, mentioned that maybe Ukrainian writers now the most important writers in the world. And I can not agree. I'm very totally.
I don't see any questions from
The audience.
at the moment, but
I'm
yeah,
happy.
go ahead.
Yeah.
That would make this be a pretty back-to-back discussion of that format. So
Well, first of all, it's a terrific film, and very much look forward to delving into this. I just would like to ask a sort of a general question about both your sort of personal feelings about this and what your sense is from sort of your collaborators and writers and so on and so forth. Many Ukrainians to whom I speak say we are sort of our culture now is the West. For obvious understandable reasons. Do you agree with that? I mean, there was it seems that by including literature that's not just contemporary since the beginning of the war, you're sort of highlighting the sort of connections with the cultural past, if only recent. How do you feel that Ukrainian writers should be dealing with this moment? Do you think it's? Let me just say, do you think that's? Do you agree with that? Do you?
Going towards Europe, but not.
Yeah, again, sort of completely understandable desire to cut cultural ties with the former imperial.
But it's not only now. We tried to cut these ties lots of times before. We tried to do it last 4 centuries, I guess, and it's nothing new but just people now finally see that we're trying to cut these ties. And previous attempts to do that, we failed. And like 100 years ago, our 20s, our executed generation, it was first attempt in modern Ukraine to cut these ties. So I think now it's just how it goes, how it should be. Maybe later we rethink it. Maybe our kids will decide what to do with this. Now our generation need to finish that finally, cut these ties. And I'm myself primarily Russian speaking. I am from Donetsk, from east of Ukraine, and my faculty of philology was always 2 departments: Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian study, and Russian. And we had all these both intersectional studies of literature, and where always in even academia, Ukrainian literature was kind of secondary literature of small people, small nation, and therefore small literature, and in comparison to great Russian. And all my professional life, as a student, and then when I was working in university, I try and politely, in a friendly way, kind of explain that Ukraine also great, you just need to read it. We can have this conversation when people ask me, okay, but where is a great example of novels like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, something, where is Ukrainian equivalent? And I ask, what have you read from Ukrainian novels? And nothing at all. It's Shevchenko, Lesya Ukrainka, yes, and everyone knew, but novels, for example, not, and how we can have any discussion based on comparison. So now it's time for us to talk about ourselves, and our civilizational choice is West. It's Europe, and always been like that. Yes, we had, even in this collection, we have some samples from Russian still, even when war started in 14, lots of our writers still continue writing in Russian. Now more and more switching to Ukrainian. It's also just naturally it goes. It's not just they force themselves to switch in some political choice. No, it's just really natural choice. I see that it's hard. It's, of course, especially Boris Khersonsky, you can read his novels here, novel story poems, and one of the poems, it's about language. And how can I abandon my native language, Russian, who's been native for 75 years for him, and now he needs to do something else. So for someone, it's still a question of choice. Someone's still in this. But again, we can't ask from this from older generation, total abandon. Language, it's always choice, personal choice. It can be just from outside, but general course now goes to Europe, and more now lingual course, just Ukrainian literature. Ukrainian will be a language of future Ukrainian literature. It's just like judging, but it's just a fact.
I have a question kind of related to that. I think, the choice, not even the choice, but, the understanding that, yes, our identity is Western is certainly manifest. And I liked the metaphor of the goose with the head in the West. But at the same time, one discussion that I've kind of seen in more political science circles is how Ukraine is not just, following the West, but rather is a leader in a lot of these values and ideals that, the West, embodies, so to speak, whatever. I know it's a very sort of amorphous thing, but I just wanted to, I've seen that in political science discussions, and I wonder if you could speak more to that in a cultural sense. And I think this project is certainly an example of that, but, further.
Yeah, so again, it's Western, just civilizational choice, and this freedom, again, this universal topic of freedom, why it resonates so much now here in America. Now we see all flags in almost every building I go by, and because it's something true. Again, it's something was with Russian literature connected to before. Why it was so popular? Because it has this ontological core, ontological essence, and that's why everyone call it great. But now we can see that actually Ukrainian literature has this ontological essence. Ukrainian literature has this core and true values, which is you can't fake. You can just write about this, not really thinking about this, not having these values as your core. And again, that's why we now receiving so much support, because we're genuine in this, and it's and we will, and we are showing now, and we'll show that freedom is something you have to fight for. It can't be just for granted. You can't have it just for granted, and sometimes, someday, you will have to fight for if you forget that you need to fight for something like that. Sorry for a little bit confusing.
But if I may just say one very quickly, this I like this formulation, the ontological core. This is really interesting, and that's why Russian literature has played such an important role in the 20th century, right? And all over the world, all the way to Japan and so on. But I think the West has not noticed it yet. That Ukrainian literature. So that's why, in other words, and not as elegantly as you did, I tried to say that authors such as Zhadan or Zabushka, they do have that, right? So they if we listen, they speak to us in the West, right? But if we don't listen, of course, we can't hear them, right? So to me, it's a question of successful communication, and this successful communication hasn't happened yet,
Absolutely.
right?
Yes.
So that
That's
is
what I was going to
it's a
talk
little
about
painful.
too.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
but
No, that's exactly what I was going to talk about. I'm Elizabeth Pfeiffer. I'm working with Gregory on trying to set up this project. And one thing is in the West, here in America, we learn almost nothing about poetry. It's something that's almost totally closed to us. So the most beautiful Ukrainian poem might not be heard here because we just don't read very much poetry. But my children talk about TikTok and all these things, these new art forms that are still just in the hands of amateurs. And I was wondering if you see something in Ukraine, some kind of new form of art that could be expressed in the West in a way that could be easily digested and really spread the message so that people would then say, okay, I'm ready to read poetry now. I'm ready to take the next step, but I need something to get my feet wet first.
Absolutely. Now, I would say we're in research of this form now. We're trying to find. Last week in New York, in La Mama Theater, Liana Tkach, she is theater director with Ukrainian roots, and she did all this play devoted to Kharkiv in 20th last century. It's also based on lyrics and music back then time, and Jordan joined this. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to got there, but it's a huge success, and American audience first of all, and of course so those who is Ukrainian origins. But in this theater played a great role. We have now working on also Luba Kimchuk. They did with Yuri Gorgy. They did songs on lyrics of, again, 20s. Now we kind of return all the time to experience and time of 20s of last century. This art project with songs on the lyrics of these poems with some video artistic. Also, it was huge, got huge interest in Europe and in UK. I don't remember if they, I guess in America, they didn't have chance to stage that, but it will be nice. We are doing now all like this in our YouTube channel, my journal. I also run a literary journal in Ukraine, both in Ukrainian and English. We're publishing interviews with prominent Ukrainians from not just literary and artists and cinema and all creative people. And also we will do these readings in both Ukrainian and English, and trying to spread information about this. While I was staying here, I also got in contact with lots of writer centers, with hub of activism, and they are happy to support. And just need to try different project, different way, and somehow someday it will explode, I hope.
As you said, Peter, it involves engagement too, right?
Yeah. I mean, the problem is, of course, also that the West is in a cultural crisis and has been for a long time, and the crisis of reading. Right. So when you said this, I usually start my courses in literature with one class where I talk about how one should read. And so Marianne Wolf has written a wonderful book, Proust and the Squid, it's called, and it's a history of reading and our reading brain. She's a brain scientist. She's a neuroscientist, and just learning to focus on a limited text, such as one poem, in such a way that I can fully take it in. And that is a question of time, of being able to focus, of enjoying this, opening it up for myself, and so on and so on. And unfortunately, many children, young people don't learn that, and so they read books the way they read screens, and that's exactly contraindicated for that, right? So it's exactly the wrong way. So in a way, maybe I don't know how much do Ukrainians read poetry, prose, these writers?
More than Americans, not too much.
Okay.
I mean, Yeah, now starting from pandemic times, we had just increasingly people started buying books, and classic literature was interesting, like fiction. With some point, we started reading nonfiction was super popular, also autobiographies, like here, the same. But during pandemic, people started reading classic literature, poetry.
Yeah.
And again, poetry is something we read all the time because I don't know, it's super important in Ukraine, and we have in our currency poets, not presidents, using this example all the time. And we have literary reading all the time. Jadon, super popular in Ukraine. He's popular poet, first of all.
Okay.
All people reading his poems all the time.
Yeah.
He's doing concert like a musical concert, and it's always sold out. It's not too much like Jadon, but several we have like more like pop, not so maybe high quality poetry, more pop poetry, but it also has all right to exist, and it's also sold out with the music on a back. So poetry is something we live every day in Ukraine. Maybe more full length works not so popular.
Yeah.
But it's changing.
But it's good when it actually appears spontaneously, right? We've had this here in the United States with the African-American community, right? I have to say, and some of my colleagues are shocked by that, but I really believe in that rap, at least some parts of rap, have genuine cultural quality and have poetic quality. Sometimes, brutal, but often very, very honest, very truthful. And I mean, poetry makes its way where we don't expect it, right? So you can't regulate it all, and you shouldn't regulate it all. But I think that's probably also one source of hope, right? That without any big education and so on, people just write poetry, right? Or make poetry, right? I think that's beautiful.
Well, unfortunately, suffering brings out beautiful art.
Yes.
And this will be important also for for whatever is going to happen in Russia. Russians need to understand that there's Ukrainian culture. Ultimately, I think it will be important. As far as our children are not taught the basic rules of grammar any longer.
Yeah.
Literally, it's frightening.
Well, at home.
Yeah, but I have to say, I hope I understood you correctly, but some Russians, for example, the film director Alexander Sakurov, he said that, and he said this to Putin in a meeting that was televised. We need, and this was before the war started, but you need to let the Ukrainians go. You need to let them do their thing. They're different from us. He said this several times. They're different from us. And and he's a great Russian artist, a great Russian director, recognized all over the world. But I thought, well, finally somebody is saying that, it shouldn't be a source for, beating somebody up or something like that. They're different. Let them do their thing. And of course, Putin could not acquiesce to that. But the fact that somebody said it, I thought this is an indicator that people begin to realize that Ukraine is something original. It's something of its own, and no denial will ever help that. No denial will ever remove that. It's there, and so that I think is a very important stage here, right? That unbiased Russians and those parts of Russia and Russian culture that are not imperial and not imperially inspired and shaped begin to realize that the imperial mode that they have been following for several centuries is misleading them and is actually destroying them themselves, right?
For this, this was
really
really
over time. Yeah. So thank you very much, Katerina. Congratulations again on this book. Thank you for attending, and thank you for watching our event. And I hope we'll have more of this. And as I said, I hope this book will encourage you to actually explore modern Ukrainian literature in a proactive manner. It is enjoyable, it is highly intellectual, and it's really worth your time. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.